The mist had settled into the bones of Brambleton-on-Wye, like an unwelcome guest who refuses to acknowledge the hour. Late October does that to the Cotswolds, wraps the whole world in damp gauze until the stone cottages look like something half-remembered from a dream. I'd pulled on my wool overcoat, the one with the fraying cuff I keep meaning to have seen to, and stepped out for my morning constitutional, same as every morning. Because routine is the last religion available to a man of my age and temperament. I am, or was, Reginald Howarth, theatre critic for the Sunday Herald for the better part of 3 decades. Retired now, voluntarily, before the paper could do it for me. I traded the West End for a village where the most dramatic event in living memory was a disputed marrow at the 2019 Harvest Fair. Also, I believed. The square was quiet that Tuesday morning. Wet cobblestones, a jackdaw picking at something near the War Memorial. Across the way, Constance Prewitt's place, the gilt crust, sat dark behind its bottle-green awning, closed sign turned outward. Constance didn't open before 9, a point of some contention among the early risers who'd long since pledged their custom to the bakery directly opposite. Flour and fancy. The bell above the door gave its usual bright little announcement as I stepped inside, and there it was. That warmth, that scent, yeast and butter and sugar conspiring in the air like a promise. Daphne Millbrook stood behind the counter in her flour-dusted apron, hair pinned loosely, hands busy with a tray of rolls. She was the sort of woman who made a room feel inhabited. Widowed 6 years, ran the place alone, laughed like she meant it. The kind of laugh that made you briefly suspect the world might not be the thoroughgoing disappointment you'd concluded it was. But that morning, the laugh wasn't there. "Almond croissant, Reginald," she said, already reaching for the tongs. "As ever, Daphne." "As ever." She set it on the counter, wrapped it in waxed paper with her usual care. But her hands paused a beat too long on the fold. "Everything all right?" I asked. She glanced toward the window, toward the square, toward the gilt crust, and then back at me with an expression I can only describe as someone trying to reassemble their composure from scattered parts. "Constance came by last evening," she said, "knocked on the shop door after close. 7:15 it must have been. Constance Prewitt, here. Said she wanted to bury the hatchet. Her words. Said it was silly, the two of us carrying on like this, year after year." Daphne wiped her hands on her apron, though they didn't need wiping. Then she asked if she might have one of my butter croissants. Called it a peace offering. Something to share with her sister, she said. "And you gave her one?" "Well, of course I did, Reginald." What was I going to do, refuse the woman a croissant? No. Of course not. That was Daphne. You extend a hand to her, she takes it. Even if something about the hand doesn't feel right. It was just odd, she said quietly. Constance hasn't set foot in this shop in 4 years. Not since the bake-off business with the lemon drizzle. And then she turns up on a Monday evening, all smiles, asking for my butter croissant. She shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe I'm being daft." "You're not daft," I said. "You're cautious. There's a difference." But I said it the way one says, "I'm sure it's nothing," to end a conversation rather than honor it. I tucked my croissant under my arm, wished her a good morning, and stepped back out into the mist. I thought nothing of it. God forgive me, I thought nothing of it at all. I carried on past the chemist, past the lich gate of St. Crispin's, past old Maurice Fenton walking his arthritic spaniel. And not once did I stop to consider why a woman who hadn't crossed that square in 4 years would choose a dark Monday evening to do so, or why she'd want the one thing Daphne was known for, the one recipe Constance had never been able to match, the butter croissant. I should have turned around. I should have sat down at that little table by the window and asked Daphne to tell me every word Constance had said, every inflection, every pause. But I didn't, because the mist was lovely, and the croissant was warm in my hand, and I was a fool who'd mistaken a quiet village for a safe one. The siren found me on my knees. I remember that with terrible precision, the feel of damp earth under my fingernails, the trowel halfway into the bed where I'd been dividing the last of the autumn crocuses. A siren in Brambleton is not a sound you process immediately. It's so foreign, so thoroughly wrong, that the mind treats it first as a mistake. A lost ambulance, perhaps, overshooting the A40. But it didn't fade. It grew. I set the trowel down on the garden wall, brushed my knees, and stood there listening. The sound wound through the valley and stopped, abruptly, definitively, somewhere near the center of the village. And I knew in that animal way one knows that something had broken. I pulled my overcoat from the hook by the back door and walked. Not quickly. Quickly would have meant I believed it. The mist had burned off by then, and the afternoon light was flat and grey, the kind that makes every stone building look older than it is. I could already see figures ahead, clustered in the square like starlings on a wire. There were perhaps 15 people gathered outside the gilt crust. For Brambleton, that constitutes a crowd. PC Helen Marsh was stretching police tape across the bakery's front entrance, and I noticed she'd tangled it on the door handle and had to start again. Her hands weren't steady. Helen Marsh had been our constable for 7 years, and the most serious business she'd ever managed was a caravan break-in near the Lechlade Road. This was not a caravan break-in. Gerald Tups found me before I found him. The postman, still in his Royal Mail fleece, face the colour of old candle wax. "She's dead, Reg." He grabbed my arm. Constance, stone dead, sitting at one of her own tables, just sitting there. Dead, I repeated because the word wouldn't properly land. I had a parcel for her, signature required, door was unlocked, but she hadn't flipped the sign. I went in and she was just... He swallowed. She was holding one of those croissants. You know the ones, the braided ones. The braided ones. I felt the ground shift under me, though it hadn't moved at all. The braided ones, Daphne's signature. The croissant she'd told me about that very morning. The one Constance had come asking for Monday evening to share with her sister. A peace offering, Daphne had said. But Constance had been alone. In her own shop, holding the thing herself. I'd stood in Flower and Fancy not 6 hours earlier and told Daphne she was worrying over nothing. I'd patted her concern away like dust from a lapel. The rest of that afternoon passed in fragments. The murmur of neighbours theorising, heart attack they said, had to be, she'd always been heavy through the chest. The arrival, near 5:30, of an unmarked grey saloon that pulled up where the ambulance had been. A woman stepped out, slight build, dark hair pulled back with severity, coat buttoned to the throat despite the mild air. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the building, then at the tape, then at Helen Marsh, and something passed between them that made Helen stand up straighter. Detective Inspector Nora Siddiqui, I learned later. County CID. She moved like someone who'd already begun measuring the room she hadn't entered yet. By early evening, the crowd had thinned, but I hadn't left. I stood near the war memorial, half hidden by the yew, and watched D.I. Siddiqui cross the square to Flower and Fancy. Daphne came to the door. I couldn't hear what was said. I could only see Daphne's face, pale, rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, the way people hold themselves when they're trying not to shake apart. She answered questions. She nodded. At one point she looked past the detective, across the square, and I believe she saw me standing there, though I couldn't be certain. They didn't take her away. Not then. But I saw how it looked. The whole village could see how it looked. A dead woman clutching her rival's croissant. A 4-year feud. A convenient story about buried hatchets. I walked home in the dark, and I thought about Daphne's face that morning. The unease I'd dismissed, the worry I'd waved off with a critic's lazy confidence that I understood the shape of every story. I had missed something. I was not going to miss anything again. I crossed the square before 7:30, the cobbles still dark with overnight dew. Hadn't slept. Not properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Constance at that table, and behind her, Daphne's face going white under the inspector's questions. So I went. The door to Flower and Fancy was unlocked, but the sign still read closed. I found Daphne in the back kitchen, standing at her worktop with both palms flat against the marble, as though she were holding the earth in place. No flour out, no dough rising. The ovens were cold for the first time in... well, I couldn't remember them ever being cold. She looked up when I came in. Eyes swollen, rimmed raw, but her jaw was set in that particular way she had, the way that said she'd been crying and decided she was finished with it. "Gerald rang me last night," she said before I could open my mouth. After the detective left, he took photographs, Reg, before that young constable chased him off. He got 3 on his phone. She slid the mobile across the counter. Gerald's hands must have been shaking because the images were blurred at the edges, but the center was clear enough. Constance's small fingers, the croissant in her grip, braided in Daphne's unmistakable herringbone pattern, and the top of it, smooth, bare, golden brown. I looked at Daphne. "That isn't mine," she said, quietly. "The way you say something when you need another human being on this earth to believe you. I mean, it is mine. It's my recipe, my braid. But it isn't the one I gave Constance on Monday evening." She pulled open a drawer and took out a small glass jar. Dried lavender sprigs, each one no bigger than a fingernail. "Every gift pastry I make, every single one, I press a sprig into the top before the second prove. It bakes in. You can't miss it. You can't brush it off. It becomes part of the crust." I looked at the photograph again. No lavender. No impression where lavender had been. Nothing. The silence between us did all the necessary work. Someone had taken one of Daphne's croissants, a purchased one, unmarked, ordinary, and placed it in a dead woman's hand. Someone who knew the feud. Someone who wanted that croissant to point like a finger straight at Daphne. "Right," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Who bought braided croissants on Monday?" She was already reaching beneath the counter. Out came the ledger, the actual paper ledger she'd kept since opening day. Columns ruled in pencil, every transaction logged in her small, precise hand. She turned to Monday's page and ran her finger down the entries. 3 names. Malcolm Hind, 2 butter croissants, 8:45 in the morning. I knew Malcolm. Property developer from Cheltenham who'd been circling Constance's lease for the better part of a year, pressuring her to sell so he could convert the shop into holiday flats. She'd told him to go to hell. Twice that I knew of. Phoebe Rackham, 1 butter croissant, 12:15. Constance's own shop assistant, 19 years old, sharp-tongued, and fresh off a screaming row with Constance the previous Thursday over 3 weeks' unpaid wages. Half the high street had heard it through the walls. And Reverend Arthur Cheswick, 6 butter croissants just after 2 o'clock. For the parochial church council meeting, he'd told Daphne at the till. Arthur, mild, egg-shaped Arthur, who judged the village bake-off for 11 years and somehow remained on speaking terms with both women throughout the whole bloody war. Daphne closed the ledger and laid both hands on it, as if swearing an oath. "I won't stand here and be fitted up, Reg. I won't." I believed her. I want to be honest about that. I believed her completely in that moment. With the cold ovens and the lavender jar and the raw determination in her voice. And if some small, treacherous instinct flickered at the back of my skull, the old critic's reflex, the habit of questioning every dish placed in front of me, I buried it before it took its first breath. "Phoebe," I said, "she worked with Constance every day. She'd know the routine, when the shop was empty, when the door was unlocked. We start with Phoebe." Daphne nodded once, picked up the lavender jar, put it back in the drawer and closed it. We were in it now. Both of us, whatever it turned out to be. Wednesday came slow. I barely slept Tuesday night either. Lay there in the dark, turning that paper ledger over in my mind. 3 names, 3 purchases, 1 dead woman, and a croissant that wasn't what it pretended to be. By Wednesday afternoon, I couldn't stand it any longer. I walked to Phoebe Rackham's cottage on the lane behind St. Barnabas, the one with the sagging iron gate and the front garden gone to seed. Foxgloves chest high, nettles colonizing the path. I hadn't even raised my knuckle to the door when I heard her. A thin, ragged crying, the kind that's been going on so long it's lost all shape. Just raw breath and misery. She answered in a dressing gown. 19 years old, eyes swollen to slits, a balled tissue in each fist like she'd been preparing for siege. The cottage smelled of cold toast and unwashed mugs. "Mr. Hathaway," she said, "I didn't do anything." I hadn't accused her of a thing. She made tea with shaking hands, and I sat at her kitchen table, which wobbled, and I listened. She spoke in bursts, stops and starts, the way the very young do when guilt and grief are fighting for the same square inch of chest. She owed me 3 weeks, 3 weeks' wages, and I shouted at her, I did, right there on the high street where everyone could hear. But I didn't. I wouldn't. She broke off, pressed both tissues to her face, and then, without any prompting from me, she said something that changed the color of everything. It was Malcolm Hind. He'd been at her for months about that lease. Constance told me she actually confided in me, which she never did. She never told anyone anything. She said he'd cornered her in the stockroom doorway and told her he'd make her life unbearable if she didn't sell. I felt my hand tighten around the teacup. The chair beneath me groaned. She was frightened, Mr. Hathaway, properly frightened. Then, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mentioned the weather, Phoebe added, "She couldn't even have certain margarines, did you know that? Some preservative in them, carried an EpiPen in her handbag. I had to check every label on anything that came into the shop. I filed that away. I didn't yet know what it meant. Daphne rang me just past 11 Thursday morning. Her voice had that edge, the one that meant she'd found something and was holding it between her teeth like a terrier. She'd taken tea with Reverend Cheswick at the vicarage. Gentle old Arthur, butter wouldn't melt. He'd bought 6 croissants at 2 o'clock Monday for the parochial church council meeting. 4 were eaten at the meeting, and Malcolm Hind, who'd attended, had taken the remaining 2 home with him. 2 of Daphne's signature braided butter croissants in Malcolm Hind's possession Monday evening. I sat with that for a long time, and then, Thursday afternoon, the ground shifted beneath all of it. The inspector, Siddiqui, I'd learned his name by then. His office confirmed it at 2:30. Allergic reaction, severe anaphylaxis. Constance Gilroy's airways had closed like a fist around a stone, and she had died gasping in her own shop. I stood in Daphne's kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand and the world rearranging itself into something terrible and precise. The ovens were lit again. She'd forced herself back to work that morning. And the smell of proving dough filled the room, and it turned my stomach for the first time in my life. "Daphne," I said, "your croissants are made with butter, pure butter, always. You know they are. If someone took one of your braided croissants and relaminated it, replaced the butter with a margarine containing that preservative, and put it in Constance's hand." She stared at me. Flour on her wrists, her face absolutely still. "They'd have used your pastry as the weapon," I said, "and your reputation as the motive. 2 birds, 1 croissant." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The dough hook on the counter dripped. A wood pigeon called from the chestnut tree outside. "He had 2 of my croissants," Daphne said quietly. "He had motive. He had threats on record, whether he knows it or not. And he was pressuring a woman with a hidden allergy." I looked at her. She looked at me. And the name settled between us like a stone dropped into still water. Malcolm Hind. Friday morning I woke before the birds. Couldn't tell you the last time that happened, perhaps the day I retired, when the silence of an empty classroom finally became real. But this was different. This was purpose. I was at Daphne's bakery by 7:30. She'd beaten me there, of course, flour on her wrists, hair pinned back, 2 trays of sourdough already proving. She was rebuilding herself loaf by loaf, and I hadn't the heart to interrupt. So I sat on the stool by the counter, the one with the wobbly leg, and I waited. It came out quietly, the way important things always do. "Reginald," she said, not looking up from her dough. "Malcolm's wife, Judith. Before she married him, she was a sales rep for Hargreaves and Lyle. Bakery supplies, commercial ingredients." She paused, pressed her knuckles into the dough. She'd have known every preservative on every label. She'd have known exactly which margarines carried the one that could kill Constance. The penny dropped with such force I felt it in my chest. Malcolm had the croissants. 2 of them, taken home Monday evening from the church council meeting. But knowledge, knowing which preservative, which brand, how to make the switch, that required expertise. And Judith Hind had spent years selling the very products that contained it. I didn't rush out. I finished my tea. Then I put on my coat and walked to Fenwick's chemist on the high street. Old Mrs. Fenwick is 83 and has run that shop since the coronation. She knows every purchase made by every soul in this village the way I once knew every student's handwriting. I bought a tin of throat lozenges, the menthol ones, dreadful, and asked after her hip. We talked about the weather. We talked about the geraniums outside St. Barnabas. And then, quite unprompted, she said it. You know, Malcolm Hind was in last week. Bought a margarine, that Suncrest brand, the one with the yellow label. I told him it was terrible stuff, full of additives, but he was quite insistent. She leaned across the counter. Odd that. Man's never baked a thing in his life. Last week, days before Constance died, premeditated. I thanked Mrs. Fenwick, bought a second tin of lozenges I didn't need. And I walked directly to the village hall. Inspector Siddiqui had set up her temporary office in the back room, the one that still smelled of the harvest festival. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, with files spread across a trestle table. She looked at me the way my sixth formers used to when I assigned extra reading, patient, faintly patronizing. I placed the ledger on her table. I laid out each piece, one after another, the croissants, Judith Hind's professional background, the margarine Mrs. Fenwick had sold him, the months of pressure over Constance's lease, Phoebe Rackham's testimony about his threats. Siddiqui listened without expression. Then she made a phone call. And her face changed. Malcolm Hind stood to inherit a fortune from a development deal, commercial property, new builds along the high street, but only if he could acquire Constance's lease. Without it, the entire scheme collapsed. This wasn't temper, this wasn't impulse, this was arithmetic. They searched his house that evening. Found the Suncrest margarine in his pantry, barely used. Found a rolling pin in the utility room, scrubbed but not scrubbed well enough. Traces of pastry dough still caught in the handles. Malcolm Hind was arrested at 9:20, Friday night. I wasn't there for it. I heard the sirens from Daphne's bakery, where I'd gone to tell her it was over. She was standing behind the counter when I said the words. For a moment she didn't move. Then her hands came up to her face, and she wept, properly wept, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't make a sound at first. This woman who had built her life around the simple sacred act of feeding her neighbors, who'd had that life nearly ripped from her by a man who saw nothing in her croissants but a convenient weapon. I sat beside her. I put the kettle on. I poured 2 cups of Earl Grey, and I didn't say another word. Some silences, you see, are the truest conversations 2 people can have. The tea went cold. Neither of us minded. A week. 7 days since Constance Pettigrew drew her last breath in the back room of the Gilt Crust, and Brambleton was trying, in its quiet English way, to carry on. Saturday morning. The autumn market had set up in the square as it always does, trestle tables sagging under jars of chutney and local honey, a fellow roasting chestnuts in a blackened drum, the smell of it catching on the damp air. I walked through it slowly. My knees demanded that much. The village looked the same as it ever had. The same bunting, the same faces. But there was a thinness to the laughter, a carefulness in how people spoke to one another, as though everyone was handling something fragile, and none of us quite trusted our grip. Malcolm Hind had been formally charged that morning. Inspector Siddiqui confirmed it when I rang her office at 8:30. Charged with murder. Not manslaughter, not reckless endangerment, murder. And by then, the full shape of what he'd done had come into sickening focus. He'd taken 2 of Daphne's croissants home from the church council meeting on Monday evening. One he ate, the other he took apart. Worked it open in that utility room of his, substituted the butter with the Suncrest margarine. The one loaded with the preservative Constance was fatally allergic to, and then he reassembled it, braided it back up, placed a sprig of lavender on top, and the next morning he left it at the door of the Gilt Crust with a handwritten note suggesting it was a peace offering from Daphne. He used her name, her reputation, her bloody croissants. He'd calculated that the village would see what he wanted them to see. 2 rival bakers, a bitter feud, a poisoned pastry, a tragic accident at best, a crime of passion at worst. And Daphne would carry the blame while Malcolm quietly collected on a property deal worth more than every shop on the high street combined. What he hadn't calculated, what a man like Malcolm Hind could never have understood, was that Daphne Tremaine knew every croissant she'd ever made the way a mother knows her children. The braid was wrong, the lavender sprig was placed at the seam rather than the crown, and she kept records, every batch, every count, logged in that flour-dusted notebook behind the till. She knew the croissant wasn't hers, and she said so. And that That is the thread that unraveled the whole rotten scheme. I paused at the memorial outside Constance's shop. Someone had laid chrysanthemums against the door, already wilting in the drizzle. A few handwritten cards had curled at the edges, ink bleeding into the damp. A jam jar of marigolds from someone's garden. Nothing grand, everything true. There are questions still unanswered, of course. What Judith Hind knew, and when she knew it, that remains to be seen. The investigation goes on. Some threads take longer to pull. The annual bake-off has been postponed. No one had the stomach for it. But I'll tell you what I noticed as I crossed the square toward my usual bench. The queue outside Daphne's bakery stretched past the post office. 15 people deep at least. Mrs. Fenwick was in it. Old Gerald with his walking frame. Young families I didn't recognize. The village had made its verdict plain, and it had nothing to do with courts or charges. They were buying her scones and her sourdough and her almond tarts because they wanted her to know, without saying it, because this is Brambleton and we don't say things, that she was theirs. I sat down on the bench. The chestnut smoke drifted across the square. My coat was damp and my hip ached, and I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And then I saw it. Daphne stepping out from behind the counter, flour on her apron, and crouching, slowly, because her knees aren't much better than mine, to hand a little girl a pastry. A pain au chocolat by the look of it. The child took it with both hands, very serious, and Daphne smiled. Not a performance, not a brave face. Just warmth, offered freely, because that's what she's always done. Malcolm Hindy tried to turn bread into a weapon. And here was Daphne Tremaine, the morning after his arrest, doing what she has done every day for 30 years, feeding her neighbors. I took a breath of cold autumn air and watched the market carry on around me. Retirement in Brambleton. Never quite as uneventful as I'd hoped.